Okay, good evening, everyone. Hopefully, you can all hear me and see me. If for some reason you can't, please let me know. I will have the chat open, so if there are any technical difficulties, please just let me know and I will try and fix them. So, in tonight's episode, we'll be doing chapter 5 in Being Disciples by Rowan Williams. And that one is called Faith in Society. So that is our chapter this evening. It's a little bit longer, I think, than the last couple. But still hopefully not too long. So since it is a little bit longer, let's try and dive right in. Before we get to that, as you may remember, we've been starting each episode with a poem. And so we're going to go ahead and do that now. The poems we have been reading over the past number of episodes are from this book, Reflections, Poems of Communion, written by a new poet named Bethany Roberts. And I'll talk more about her at the end of the episode. But for right now, let me go ahead and proceed. So this poem is called Clear Eyes. Sing, shining from the battle, with your hair pulled back, and your eyes clear and bright in the light of day, for you are descended from some unearthly thing, too wild to know what it is to be tamed. You know the voice that speaks in the shadows. Your light is growing dimmer. But there remains some divine desire in you, some baser instinct that is yet pure, that sings back against the dark. I will grow brighter. So again, that poem was Clear Eyes by Bethany Roberts in this book, Reflections, Poems of Communion. So now let's go back to Being Disciples by Rowan Williams. Again, this is chapter 5. Let me just get a quick so if you'll remember, each chapter begins with a scripture passage, and the passage for this one is 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 12 through 26. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in the one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot were to say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear were to say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole body were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many members, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and those members of the body that we think less honorable we clothe with great honor, and our less respectable members are treated with greater respect, whereas our more respectable members do not need this. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. What place does Christian discipleship have in a modern democratic society? For many people, especially in Europe, there is a simple answer. Its place is in private. A modern society naturally takes it for granted that people are free to believe and practice what they wish. So if they decide to believe and practice Christianity or any other religion, that is their affair. But this freedom is no different from their freedom to buy what they like or wear what they like. It is an individual matter and should not affect the way they act as citizens in their society. And it is unthinkable that the law of their society should favor any one set of religious opinions any more than it should give a special place to a particular set of preferences in artistic taste, food, clothes, or cars. Religion may be respected in a general sort of way and defended as a right by the law, but it does not belong in the sphere of public decision-making and policy. This kind of secular approach has its origins in the European Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. After a period of savage religious wars, there was a strong and understandable desire to avoid further conflict over religion, and a deep suspicion of religious authority as oppressive and irrational. Many intellectuals believed that moral behavior combined with a vague reverence for a supernatural creator was something that all reasonable people were capable of grasping and putting into practice. They did not need revelation from heaven or religious institutions with priests and sacred books to tell them what they could work out for themselves. Religious authorities had no place in the government of a country. As the modern age developed, a further element came to play a part in this. The idea of human rights became increasingly powerful. For many, if not most, who thought about it, this meant that each human individual was born with an intrinsic claim to be treated with respect, possessed of a natural dignity and liberty that should be recognized by the law. That liberty was essentially a freedom to choose what would make the individual contented. It was obviously limited by considerations of harm to others. A reasonable and fair society would be one in which each person's freedom to choose and to pursue their happiness was respected, and each person was protected from being seriously disadvantaged by someone else exercising their freedom. And this became an important aspect of modern capitalism, with its goal of increasing every individual's range of personal choices. So the ingredients developed of a particular kind of modern secularism. On the basis of what I have been describing, the ideal society appears as one in which the government as a whole does not promote the values of any one philosophy or religion, except to affirm universal human rights to free choice. It does not give public recognition or support or privilege to any religious body, though it allows religions to exist as private associations, so long as they do not threaten the way in which society overall carries on its business. In different degrees, this is the assumption behind several modern societies. France is the clearest example, but the USA, despite its high level of religious practice, is in theory committed to this as well. Other countries, Britain, Germany, Italy, for example, have a more complicated position in that there is still a measure of public recognition for religion and for Christian principles and values in particular. There is, however, fierce debate about whether that is a good thing in contemporary circumstances. How does this affect the Christian disciple? I'll begin to answer that by making some observations about two particular concerns that political commentators regularly raise about this basic model of a secular society and how it functions. The first of these concerns, often raised by left-wing commentators, is that the market, while obviously the main organ by which any society secures and develops its common prosperity, does not ensure anything like an equitable distribution of resources. both within particular societies and between different nations. Damaging inequalities have grown to the extent that they begin to affect the proper functioning of societies themselves. We are more aware than ever of the difficulties of securing real fairness in trade conditions for countries that have never had a foot on the ladder of the world economy. A second concern, often pointed out by conservative critics, is that when our culture is so full of the language of relative values and so obsessed with consumerist patterns of behavior, it is not clear where people can find the motivation to act for the sake of others or simply to value things and people that are not of immediate economic use. Until fairly recently, the inequalities of society were made less stark by the networks of voluntary agencies and charities that cared for those who were overlooked and damaged by wider social processes. But our age is one in which the spirit of volunteering often receives less encouragement. What is more, if society has no moral orientation by which to guide younger citizens, what will fill the gap? As stable patterns of family life are undermined by the same short-term consumerism that prevails in economics, as people become less willing or psychologically able to make the long-term and unconditional commitments of marriage and parenting, we cannot assume that children will grow up with clear moral priorities. And the effect on the young, as recent studies in the UK have shown with alarming clarity, is to produce a generation not of free spirits, but of young people often bored and unhappy in a new and worrying way, vulnerable to mental illness as never before. The rational philosophy of the last couple of centuries has been weakened. One of the paradoxes is that many people now mistrust and undervalue science almost as much as they do religion, because they do not take for granted the same confident attitude to reason and objective argument, and because advances in science and technology have brought their own nightmares and crises: nuclear warfare, genetic engineering, environmental pollution. It is not surprising that this mistrust is widely felt. The philosophy of human rights remains the cornerstone of so much of what we do in our legal systems, but we are much more aware of the clash of competing rights, the risk of individualism, the assumption that I can always enforce what I believe is due to me. We are beginning to see that these things create a society that is aggressive and suspicious, where trust is in short supply. We cannot turn the clock back, and I don't believe we can or should suppose that a society run according to strict religious principles would be happier or easier. Traditional Muslims can and do argue that in the muddle and fragmentation of Western societies, only Islam is able to weld a cohesive society together in our present chaos. But it is not as though a single clear system of Islamic government exists that can be persuasively presented to the world, and the difficulties Muslim legal scholars often have about the limits to freedom of public religious diversity leave a question about how much of our conventional understanding of human rights is compatible with some strict Islamic legal philosophies. But what the dialogue with Islam has done is to remind people in our Western societies that not everyone in the world simply takes for granted the same rational and secular basis for life. And if we disagree with the Islamic analysis, what have we to offer in its place as the basis for a moral society? I want to suggest that there are two principles of Christian faith and discipleship that we need to form part of that basis. We are each of equal value to God, and we are all dependent on each other. We cannot do without them if we are ever to secure true justice and lasting peace and stability. We are each of equal value to God. For the Christian disciple, human dignity, and therefore any notion of human rights, depends upon the recognition that every person is related to God before they are related to anything or anyone else. God has defined who they are and who they can be by his own eternal purpose, which cannot be altered by any force or circumstance in this world. People may refuse their calling or remain stubbornly unaware of it, but God continues to call them, and to offer them what they need to fulfill their calling. And the degree to which that calling is answered or refused has consequences for eternity. This means that whenever I face another human being, I face a mystery. There is a level of their life, their existence, where I cannot go, and which I cannot control because it exists in relation to God alone. A secret word he speaks to each one, whether they hear or refuse to hear, in the phrase from the prophecy of Ezekiel. The reverence I owe to every human person is connected with the reverence I owe to God, who brings them into being and keeps them in being. I stand before holy ground when I encounter another person, not because they are born with a set of legal rights which can be demanded and enforced, but because there is a dimension of their life I shall never fully see, the dimension where they come forth from the purpose of God into the world with a unique set of capacities and possibilities. The Christian disciple will have the same commitment to human rights and human dignity, but they will have it because of this underlying reverence, not because of some legal entitlement. It means that there are no superfluous people, no spare people in the human world. Everyone is needed for the good of all. Human failure is tragic and terrible because it means that some unique, unrepeatable aspect of God's purpose has been allowed to vanish. As the great Russian novelist Boris Pasternak makes one of his characters say in Dr. Zhivago, we can easily forget how the empires of the ancient world simply assumed that vast numbers of human beings could be sacrificed and slaughtered without a second thought. But the Christian gospel declares that there is nothing more godlike and precious than a single human person. It means, therefore, that a human person is worth extravagant and lasting commitment. A human being deserves complete attention and care, whether rich or poor, whether they will live for a day or for 9 decades. It is typical of Christian practice, for example, that the dying received costly and devoted care, and that those who do not have productive mental capacities, as we usually understand them, are treasured, and that children and even the unborn are regarded with respect. It is also typical of Christian practice that it is vital and energetic that people feel able to make the lifelong commitment of marriage to each other, because the beloved person will never be completely understood or captured even in decades of relationship. The transient force of sexual attraction is in this way transfigured by a sense of the uniquely personal, and something radical and exciting becomes possible. Our crisis in sexual morality in the developed world is not just about a failure to keep rules. It is about a loss of that sense of personal mystery and the calling to explore and enjoy someone else's mysteriousness for a lifetime. This principle also means that no one's value can be measured simply by how successful or how productive they are. There will always be something precious that does not need to be proved by success. Something that escapes what society expects or demands. At the highest, this may be the special calling of the artist, but it can also mean the respect and care given to all those who do not fit into the expectations of an increasingly impatient and demanding culture, with its obsessive overwork and consequent stress. The Christian vision of persons who are related to God before anything or anyone else represents a way of truly valuing work and patience, but also of valuing leisure and capacity to receive as well as give. If our developed societies are marked by the tendency to ignore the uniqueness of individuals, to load ever more demands for work and measurable production onto them, to glamorize success and despise failure, and to turn sex into a recreation instead of lasting creative partnership, the Christian disciple will say, all this is a predictable result of abandoning the belief that each person is the work of God. And we can go further than this, because God's creation is wider than the human race. What is true of persons is also true of things. Some early theologians of the Eastern Church spoke of each element in the material world carrying a word from God, revealing an aspect of God's life and wisdom. If we believe this, we shall not be inclined to treat the world around us as if it were just a quarry from which we take what we want and exploit it. In the sphere of ecology and the crisis of our environment, we are now more than ever conscious of the need for something like a religious perspective to be brought back into our attitude to a world that is not ours, but once again is related to God before it is related to us. In the Bible, God calls the world good before human beings are even in it. We are all dependent on each other. All this is a substantial enough picture of what Christian faith and discipleship brings to our attitudes to social life, and thus far it is still quite close to what a Jew or a Muslim or a Hindu might say, despite its clear foundation in the teaching of Jesus. People of many faiths can share these ideas and work on them together in society. But there is an extra element brought by Christianity to the creation of a good society, and this is the second principle I want to underline. The New Testament describes what happens when human beings are brought into relationship with Jesus Christ by faith as a community in which everyone's gifts are set free for the service of others. The community that most perfectly represents what God wants to see in the human world is one where the resources of each person are offered for every other, whether those resources are financial or spiritual or intellectual or administrative. This is the pattern of the body of Christ as St. Paul defines it. It is not only that the least or apparently most useless has the dignity of possessing a gift and a purpose. It's also that everyone is able to give to others, to have the dignity of being a giver, being important to someone else. And instead of being a static picture of everyone having dignity, the Christian vision is dynamic. Everyone is engaged in building up everyone else's human life and dignity. Such a vision bears very directly on the question of motivation. The religious language I've been referring to takes for granted a basic attitude of reverence connected with thanksgiving. What is before us, the human and non-human material of the world, is mysteriously related to God, and thus pregnant with God's gift for us. To interact reverently and lovingly with this human and non-human world is not only to express that basic attitude, but also to open yourself hopefully to whatever gift God has for you, in whatever circumstance or aspect of the world. It is both an unselfish approach, concerned that human and non-human world should be not just what I want it to be, but what God has designed it to be, and a self-interested one to the degree that I recognize that I cannot be what God designs me to be without the life of others also developing according to God's plan. And the stress in Christian thinking on the active responsibility laid on each person means that whoever takes the lead, whether government or private initiative, there is a calling to be involved in the work of setting each other free, to respond to the possibilities opened up by God. The Christian vision is not therefore one in which the person's choice is overridden by a religiously backed public authority. History tells us that when churches try directly to exercise political authority, they often compromise their real character as communities of mutual giving and service. Equally, when they retreat in the face of power, they risk betraying their Christian distinctiveness. Christian discipleship, it seems, means living out of the vision of relationships in the body of Christ without being afraid of conflict with the rest of society, because sometimes that living out of these relationships can be unpopular with society. Christians then are not called to impose their vision on the whole of society. If they have a role in the political realm, it is that they will argue that the voice of faith should be heard clearly in the decision-making processes of society. The Christian disciple, in other words, does not campaign for political control, which would undermine their appeal to the value of personal freedom, but for public visibility, for the capacity to argue for and defend their vision in the public sphere, to try and persuade both government and individuals that a better moral basis exists for ordering public life. How can Christians make a difference? The greatest public influence that can be exercised by Christian disciples in a complex modern democracy is simply contained in the messages given by types of behavior that embody the radical aspect I have been talking about. Voluntary activity that conveys this message will have the potential over time to shift what society takes for granted. And whether or not legislation arises from this, which can only happen if an overwhelming majority of a population is persuaded of the rightness of some change, like the abolition of slavery, for example, the climate will be different and new possibilities for human beings will be seen to open up. The Christian hospice is a singularly powerful example of witness arising from a serious commitment to the mystery of each person made for relation with God. Another is the active involvement of congregations in monitoring their commitment to fair trade as expressed in what they choose to buy and how they bring consumer pressure to bear on issues of production and marketing. This too can be an effective witness. In the UK, we are also developing a variety of simple ways in which individuals and congregations can monitor their environmental footprint, a small but significant contribution to raising general awareness of this question as a moral and spiritual matter. Quite often, as with the case of environmental concerns, Christian and other religious bodies are uniquely well placed to pick up those causes that have been slow to attract mainstream political support because they do not win votes. The reform of prison conditions is another such cause that has drawn much support from churches in the UK. It has to be recognized that the apparently rational and equitable processes of secular democracy are always vulnerable to the requirements of the electoral process, which are sadly not always rational and equitable. Large-scale issues about public prosperity dominate these conflicts, and it is hard to find a hearing for other questions of longer-term significance. And longer-term here does not mean less urgent. Churches and other faith groups might be called the trustees or custodians of the long-term questions because they own a vision of human nature that does not depend on political fashions and majorities. A healthy democracy, then, is one in which the state listens to the voices of moral vision that spring from communities that do not depend on the state itself for their integrity and meaning. In this chapter, I've been suggesting some of the specific ways in which the Christian model of humanity and the world in relation to God can open doors for renewed political vision. The Christian disciple is not seeking to make the state into a church, but is proposing to the state and to the culture in general a style and direction of common life, the life of the body of Christ, that represents humanity at its fullest. A determinedly secular society is always in danger of becoming closed upon itself, never really coping with radical criticism, lacking a forum for discussing general moral priorities, and reluctant to change. That is perhaps the essence of the Christian contribution in the public sphere. It is a voice that questions from a wholly different perspective, the kind of perspective that cannot be generated by corporate self-interest. It is a conversation partner and what has sometimes been called a critical friend to the state and its laws. It questions the foundations of what the state takes for granted, often challenging the shallowness of a prevailing social morality. It pushes for changes to make the state a little more like the community that it is itself representing, the kingdom of God. It does not make the mistake of talking as though politics could bring the kingdom into being on earth, but it continually seeks to make the promise of the kingdom more concrete and visible in the common life of human beings, private and public. In short, it tells the state not that it is unimportant or subordinate to some higher earthly power, just that it is relative in the perspective of God. Being disciples means being called to see others, and especially others in profound need, from the perspective of an eternal and unflinching, unalterable love. I hope and pray that we as disciples will respond to this by the strength of God's Holy Spirit, and that we can proclaim this vision as the firmest possible ground for hope in all human societies, Eastern or Western, past, present, or to come. So that is the end of the chapter. So we come now to the section of discussion. I'm going to give it a minute for the video to kind of catch up to me here, because I know there's a bit of a delay on the YouTube and Twitch and so forth. So if you have any thoughts, please make sure I can see the chat. So make sure and type into chat either on, like I said, on YouTube or on Twitch. I should be able to see either one. And while I'm waiting for that, I'm going to go ahead and read the first of the questions here for reflection or discussion. How does your Christian community act in ways that demonstrate a commitment to the dignity of every person? That's an excellent question. One of the reasons why I particularly like the Episcopal Church that I'm part of is that I feel that the Episcopal Church, which of course is related to the Church of England that Rowan Williams is part of, kind of does this bit particularly well. Now that's not to say denigrate or look down the way any other church does anything. I'm just saying that I feel that the Episcopal Church does these things quite well. One of the examples which I'm going to actually put into the chat in just a moment is that, so the Episcopal Church, for example, has the Episcopal Relief and Development. It's an entity specifically designed to help people. You know, it's kind of like a sort of halfway version of the Red Cross, although, like I said, there's some development stuff in there, not just relief. And so they work with disaster areas. They work to help develop areas that are underserved and so forth. And one of the things they do is try and help in relief when there are major disasters. For example, Hurricane Laura that recently went through in the Gulf Coast. I'm actually going to go ahead and put in the chat right now a link to the Hurricane Relief Fund from Episcopal Relief and Development. And then this is just one example. You know, they have a large presence. They're a big organization that is part of the Episcopal Church. Another one is the Episcopal Migration Ministries. They help refugees and immigrants, both of which are, you know, kind of the fringes of society. You know, they point out that they have helped refugees from Syria and so forth. They do not make someone being Christian any sort of requirement for their help. They will help whoever needs it, and they are actually one of the largest refugee organizations in the country, the Episcopal Migration Ministries. If you come down to more local levels, you know, and I would point out that it is through our, you know, each congregation is part of a diocese, which lets us help other congregations in our diocese when they need help. And each diocese is part of the national church, which allows us to help other dioceses. I remember attending a diocesan council here in West Texas a few years ago, after a different hurricane came through and put a lot of damage to our to a lot of areas in our diocese along the Gulf Coast of Texas. And one of the interesting things was, to me, one of the inspiring things was how they talked about how we were being helped by other dioceses. How there was, I believe, the Diocese of Texas next to us, which had also gotten hit by the hurricane, but I guess felt they were a little more financially secure or something, sent money to try and help out. I remember hearing how apparently a diocese in New Jersey contacted us because apparently a number of churches here had sent carpenters and materials and things like that back when Hurricane Sandy hit up there a number of years ago, and they wanted to sort of pay back the favor, pay back the care, the Christian care that had been given to them, and they also gave money. That's just one example of how being part of that large church organization can certainly help and have allow a greater impact on the world than maybe one individual church by itself might be able to do. But that's not to say that the small individual churches don't do their part as well. I've heard of churches that, host school programs for schools that are, for one reason or another, unable to host some after-school programs. I've heard churches of hosting things like that. I know here at St. Andrews we do a food pantry ministry. We work with the San Antonio Food Bank to help distribute food to those who need it, and not just food, sometimes diapers and stuff for babies, even like dog food and cat food. All these things we sometimes can get from the food bank, and we help to distribute them. People come, and it's not an insignificant number of people. I believe last time I heard it's something like, I don't know, 30 or 40, maybe even more than that, families that are helped out. And these are not families that specifically go to this church. We don't ask what their religion is. We don't ask what their, we don't have any requirements. We just give the help to those who need it. Let me go ahead and put this link in here into the chat. Another example was there is a diocese called the Diocese of the Navajo Land, I think is what it's called. Basically encompasses not surprisingly, a number of Indian reservations. And one of the problems that they face there sometimes is getting fresh water. And it turns out that, there were some people here in this diocese that were experts on drilling and so forth, and so they've managed to hook up to go out there and begin drilling wells and stuff for different communities to help them out. This is, in my opinion, one of the most important aspects of Christianity is caring for others. And sometimes not just giving I mean, yes, we need to give ourselves, but also remembering to ask for help when we need it, which is not always an easy thing to do. You'll, in from big picture things even to small things. If you need something, it's part of being Christian to help others and to try and seek help when you need it. So I think the Episcopal Church and the Church of England, the Anglican Communion as a whole, does particularly. And like I said, that's not to denigrate or belittle what any other congregation denomination does. Most denominations I know of have various entities to help with all sorts of things like this as well, and food drives and drives to give glasses to children in Honduras and all sorts of things going on. So let's take a look here. I don't see anyone writing in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and look real quick at the second question. Can you think of good examples of Christian communities locally, nationally, or internationally making an effective contribution to public debate and decision? The unfortunate truth is that I often can think of them not making a positive contribution, but many groups calling themselves Christians that make negative contributions because they seek to be that thing that he said, that Rowan Williams said right here we shouldn't be, which was to try and impose their moral vision, to impose their specific view on the rest of society, which is not a great use of things. But I would point out that some of those big entities that I just mentioned, like the Episcopal Relief and Development and the Episcopal Migration Ministries, do speak out and do try and put pressure with politicians and so forth to help advocate for those areas that they're concerned with, that they need. So, I mean, absolutely. And, of course, historically, some of the biggest examples, one of the biggest examples, which, we should all consider at the moment when our society is having a conversation about race, is that this is not to say that all abolitionists in history were Christians, but a lot of the abolitionist movement was driven by people of faith who felt that slavery was incompatible with the Christian message. And they campaigned. They changed the world. They stood against the economic interest. Like he mentioned, they stood against the economic interest, and they changed the world, sometimes in ways that it's hard to remember. One example Rowan Williams is from the United Kingdom. One example in their history specifically is the abolitionist movement was very much bound up with as a religious movement in the UK. A number of different denominations pressuring, and in the end they not only got managed to put enough pressure that they were able to convince the government to change the policy to end slavery throughout the British Empire, but they actually managed to put enough pressure to commit the government to ending the slave trade everywhere, even places that weren't the British Empire. To that end, the British government at the time, this was in the early 1800s, early to mid 1800s, committed immense amounts of money and resources and diplomacy to ending the transatlantic slave trade. They sent a fleet of ships to the west coast of Africa to patrol for any slave ships. If a ship was found to be carrying slaves, the slaves were freed, the ships were impounded, and the crew was arrested. And they used the money and diplomatic influence of the British Empire to pressure other countries into allowing them to, stop ships that might be carrying slaves that were flying the flags of those countries, and so it's a major accomplishment. Today, in the modern day, if you listen in the UK especially, and again here with entities like the Episcopal Migration Ministries, and I believe I don't know the specific name of the organization, but the Roman Catholic Church in the United States has something similar to the Episcopal Migration Ministries, and them and the Church of England back in the UK put a lot of pressure on, did what they could to put as much pressure as possible on their governments to help with refugees. Sometimes in some cases, things have been a little bit successful, not as successful as they can be. But it's an ongoing fight. So I think that in helping the poor, in helping the homeless, in helping the sick, in helping the migrants, in helping refugees, that religious communities can still have a great place in the public square, trying to bring pressure to bear on these issues. And I would encourage this to happen in not only a ecumenical but an interfaith way, because of course if the different denominations were to join together, they would represent even greater numbers of people, and in the end that is how you generally convince politicians to change policies, especially if it's against the economic interest of a country. But we have to remember that there are all sorts of things that government does that is not specific to economic interest. Providing things like libraries and parks and things of this nature. These are not specific to economic interests. So the government can't be run like a business, because it's not a business. It has to do things other than just economy. Anyway, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up for this evening. I hope that you will consider donating to the link in the chat for the hurricane relief of the Episcopal Relief and Development. I strongly encourage you to go out and try and change your community, whether that's through giving money or time, work in a soup kitchen, try and teach children who aren't educated, whatever the issue. We're called to help others. It's, love our neighbors as ourselves. It's a pretty big and major part of the gospel. And so, my friends, I think that is going to be it for this evening. Our next episode will be this coming Saturday at 6 p.m. That will be Chapter 6, which, Life in the Spirit is the name of that chapter. That'll be our last chapter for this book. I'm still deciding on what the next book will be, but I will have decided by Saturday. So I hope you all have a great evening. Thank you for joining me. If you have been enjoying the poetry of Bethany Roberts that I read at the beginning and would like to obtain a copy of her book, you can contact her through her Instagram, which I am putting into the chat now. You can also find it in the video description on YouTube to get a copy of that. Also on YouTube, if you would like to obtain a copy of the book we've been reading, Being Disciples by Rowan Williams, you will find links in the video description to this book's page on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and if you are inclined to support independent booksellers, The Twig is an independent bookseller here in San Antonio. If you have missed any of the episodes so far of this specific section, being series on this book, Being Disciples, you'll find a link in the chat now to the playlist where you can see all of those episodes. If you would like to see some of the other things we've already read here on Stvpett Reads, I am putting a link now to the list of all episodes covering all books that we've read. So I hope you all have a great evening, and I will see you on Saturday.